Hi, folks. We are finishing up the 13th chapter of Acts today, which brings us to the second portion of the story of Paul and Barnabas preaching to the people of Antioch and the surrounding areas. Now, we heard about the sermon that they preached from Brittany yesterday that tells the story of God's saving work throughout history and through Jesus in particular. And here we hear about all of these people who have recently converted to the Way, as the early form of Christianity was called, asking Paul and Barnabas to preach these things they have found so powerful to the Judeans in the area. Now, there are two important things to remember anytime we read a portion of the New Testament that mentions the Judeans, or especially if it's translated Jews. The first thing to remember is that this Greek word, which sounds like Judeans but is often translated Jews, is difficult to translate primarily because religion and culture have been very interconnected for most of human history. Today, we tend to think of religion as a piece of culture that's separable from other pieces of culture, largely because of the Protestant Reformation that has made us focus on belief as a central aspect of religion. We, as individual thinkers, choose the things that we think about God and about the world, and we associate ourselves with the traditions that are associated with those ideas. That's one way, and can be a very powerful way, to relate to God and to each other, especially if you're a very cognitive sort of person. But it's also pretty new in human history. Of course, people believed things about God and the world for ages. I had a professor who once said that there are as many beliefs about God as there are people, probably more, because many of us have multiple beliefs about God that are conflicting inside of our own heads. But for most of human history, the emphasis was much more on practice, on what you ate, who you ate with, how you prayed, where you worshipped, these sorts of things. You would inherit these from your community, and they were an inherent part of culture. They were just the thing that you do. And that's still the case in many religions even today. The second thing to remember is that the earliest followers of Jesus were themselves what we would today call Jews. And that means that a lot of this animosity that we read in stories like this story, which has Paul and Barnabas talking about how they have chosen not to follow Jesus, and that somehow entails that they're like forgotten by God or something dramatic, or at least that's often how it's interpreted. The thing is that a lot of this animosity is really much less of a divine condemnation and much more a reflection of human trauma. See, a lot of these earliest followers were Jewish, and the reason that Paul and Barnabas end up turning to so many Gentiles to preach is that these earliest followers were preaching to their synagogues and to their families, and their families and their synagogues were kicking them out of their church communities, basically. This is unfortunately something that's familiar to a lot of us, where we have told people things that we believed deeply about God. We've done things that we thought were incredibly connected to God and deeply holy, and some of our religious communities have totally rejected us because of that. And that was some of what was happening. They just didn't think Jesus was the Messiah, and they were not having these sermons from these early followers, and a lot of them got kicked out. And so some of this tension and this anger that you feel when you read these stories, especially in like the Gospel of John or in portions of Acts that talk about the Jews, it's because there's this just like sadness and grief from these people who have been kicked out of their communities, where they grew up, where their families worship. So these are really important things to remember. And they're things that have, when misinterpreted, which they have constantly been, created a huge history of violence between Christians and Jews, where Christians have decided that somehow God breaks promises, which I hope is not something that you think about God. And quite frankly, I mean, it shouldn't be in this passage what we think is going on. Paul and Barnabas are preaching explicitly about how God continually keeps promises and continually saves people and continually finds new ways to interact with the world and new ways to bring more people into the divine story. And I hope sincerely that even if you have been rejected by your faith communities in the past, that as time goes on, you are experiencing more and more of this idea that God is continually saving and continually bringing people into the story, and much less of this animosity and condemnation. Have a good weekend. I miss you all. You are all wonderful. Bye.